By May of 1944, the Allied Supreme Mediterranean Theater had remained in frustration of the high hopes of successful campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, but was quickly dashed during the invasion of mainland Italy, where intensified had been open routes to Germany's doorstep. Although intentionally the term soft underbelly of Winston Churchill as the progress of the swap halt of the heavy Gustav line, Hitler's veteran troops showed no signs of retreat and surrender. Frustrated by the lack of success by Allied planners, had already forgotten the green light for a second front. After years of careful invasion, it was chosen Invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord. It involved the the American First Army, the British Second, and under the overall command of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Each army was assigned to one or more of five Normandy landing sites, codenamed Omaha, Gold Sword, and Juno. Over 140,000 men were involved in the initial attack when the beaches were hit. The simulations for hours of June 5th. However, due to poor weather conditions, the invasion was launched on June 6th. The Commonwealth landed on Gold and Juno, and Sword Beach's task of calming and importing rail hub to the near copycat airfield on the further west of the American forces would land on the bloody struggle of the beaches of Omaha and Utah. Their objective was to get the isolated actual Pentagon, in which that they were containing the Shibu and facing the landing army of the formidable defense of the Atlantic Wall. Thus so far has been proving intimate to Allied air raids manned by 50,000 Germans, although the naval bombardment for 2 hours period to the landing has managed to crack the German bunkers. Heavy guns and still remain intact and open fire to the approaching landing craft. The men aboard the landing craft that could have only the grip of the 88mm shell that splashed next to them. The Allied equipped their numbers with tanks in travel and could be dropped into shallow waters, but the infantry of the 6-foot waves of rendered modification almost useless to their transport, having entered the dasher shores of precious cargo and sand. Several sunk by enemy fire and water obstacles and proceed. Despite these heavy setbacks, the British soldiers rushed the entrance of the German positions, equipped nothing but their small arms. Throughout the MG-42 shredded whole platoons, they dismantled the Germans, unable to repel the armored vehicles, started to make ashore, and one of these vehicles finally silenced the deadly 88mm cannon that has been firing the whole morning. The British sites of Juno Beach and the Canadians would give a chance to prove themselves to its American neighbor. It's not just a shallow leave of minefields, landing nearby villages and heavily fortified. However, heavy casualties, the brave men of the Canadian 3rd Infantry broke through the German defenses and secured Juno Beach by mid-having operation. Now the 3rd linked up from the Gold Beach, now pursued the landing of frustration and disorganized German US forces. Meanwhile, or not having much love from the moment of the landing crafts of the 630 and 9th began to go wrong of the amphibious assault vehicles could not handle the heavy sea, and the 23 that made it to beach was lacking of heavy armament, meaning that infantry is not easy to advance with slaughtered of the attempts to stretch the sand shore of the enemy bunkers, and Omaha Beach was the last to storm on D-Day. The poor weather condition meant that the men was wandered offshores and themselves completely wrong on the landing site. However, these highly confused soldiers had forced the units simply to go press and beyond it. Greater powers have forgiven the chaos meant to movement of the looming and the American landing zones of the Duke 100 foot and 30 meters tall and the perimeter of the German network bunkers, 6 massive and 150mm case mount guns, while men crawled on the sand below the soldiers. The assault on the enemy strongholds. The first Rangers reached the cliff of 7:10 a.m. They scaled using just the remaining ladders, no launchers, but the Rangers had successfully cleared the bunkers and had reached the cemento cage of 150mm guns located, and finally, silenced. Only then did they discover the futility of the operation. Both of guns were missing and removed days earlier, after they approved the magnet of the Allied bombing. Ruined total of 225 man assault left. Nearly half of their numbers were lying dead or wounded. Heavy casualties were much of the fault of the Allied intentions. Anything else at 8:30 a.m. in the first German counterattack had struck Omaha, and now the heavily contested, heavily armored landing zones. Several would follow throughout a successful most occurring on the August of 4th. 21st Panzer Division armored the range of coast and the lines of the vulnerability of the corridor between Juno, Sword, and without stagnation of the worst scenario, no matter how many troops the Allies had landed, still lacking the firepower to deal with the new threat. Unfortunately, the German counterattack would be foiled by the factors that the Allies have been manipulating in the anticipation of D-Day. Before we continue this action, we shall pull back and go back to the roses of April 1944. The Allied planes began a bombing campaign against German positions in France, where the Luftwaffe was occupied in the east. The Allied outnumbered the Axis counterparts by 30-1. The Allies invaders have damaged the coastal artillery placement and the airfields of the railway bridges network and frequently used for veterans. However, the Allied bombings was much misdirected about the destruction of the Operation Fortitude was assigned to the Confidential of the Germans and the northern France part. Not even the largest Operation Bodyguard Fortitude was to involve a diplomatic communication of false information and the known double agents of the Allies. Considering a decoy that was known the Dovert of the United States Army, the fictional and formidable landing of the General George PSD that slapped my soldiers. As patent result, the Allies and Axis wasted resources fortifying the position of Calais as far as the coast of Norway. The men of the 21st Panzer found themselves standing unsupported, and similarity of the armored division available during the Field Marshal von Rommel's request to put tanks on the coast. In France, they were stationed close to the coastline as immediately as possible, but the division was split all over France. The deception was not enough for Allied troops, though. They needed an insurgent of the enemy line prior to the landings for disruption of the German response, and the only way via air despite troops. Heavy risk of American airborne divisions was scheduled to drop in the morning of the invasion. As they approached their drop zone, the C-47 Dakota transport planes of the Americans 100 and the 82 Division was found themselves into subject of unexpected and anti-aircraft fire. Thanks to many paratroopers, this has ended scattered across Normandy. However, these lands have initially landed in the Prevail zone. The British paratroopers was responsible for carrying 2 defended bridges and held the repeated tank attacks, and one of the locations which was remain bases of the bridge that resembles the British paratroopers who had captured and held D-Day members for 120 hours. It had destroyed several other bridges of Normandy and further delaying the German response as D-Day drew to its bloody close. Thousands of Allied soldiers lay dead in the precious little show of sacrifice. Although they had pushed several hundred miles inland, Gold Juno Beach had linked up successfully. The other beaches, especially Omaha, was still very exposed and optimistic to Allied planners assumed by now more than several hundred towns should be under siege from the peninsula, which in fact it wasn't. They were late, and the Allies failed to know any achievements and hold the beaches against the determined German assault units. The counterattack on the 21st Panzer Division in particular was devastating to prevent forces from Sword Juno beaches from linking up. The forward investigation of the several factors of the Allied forces began an air superiority initially bombing of the German tanks, forcing them back. From the beaches, they were surrounded by tanks and fortified by armored units of the small towns while the drivers were pushing back. It was worse and worse, and the supply drought and the pangs have been deteriorating. The harbors, 2 weeks later, has been sending more and more reinforcements to finally calm the now being full defended Panzer Division. During the 2 battalions, 2 deadly Tiger tanks, and macerated of the German armor, the British were repulsed in the June of 30. This repeated failed intentions of the Allied headquarters, especially surrounded by Beard Montgomery, who considered that they would not have the large bordern of the Western. At this point in the Germans that had suffered of their own shortages, the war had been taking a priority, and above many of the 60 and so divisions of the army that was stationed in France, several of these were lacking heavy equipment, and the attempts to mask and decept these forces were foiled by Allied bombardment sabotage plans from the French resistance, and the German communication was relieved at best.